Well, hey there, and welcome to this fourth installment of the Foundation series from Christ Community Church. I'm Pastor Brandon. In the past few classes, we've talked about theology and about God and who God is and how God has spoken to us. We've talked about the structure of the Bible, the primary way that God has revealed to us his personality and acts with people. And today we're going to be talking about one of the guiding principles of the Bible, one of the guiding principles of the way that God has spoken to his people through the years, and that is through covenants. Now, first, we have to understand what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement between two parties. Now, these covenants can be conditional. That means that there are conditions that each side must keep in order to keep the covenant together. Or it can be unconditional. And that means that the covenant stands, the agreement stands, no matter what happens between the two parties. And in the Bible, we find both conditional and unconditional. Now, a covenant can also be between two people of equal power, in which these two people must keep certain conditions in order to keep the covenant intact, or it can be between a more powerful and a lesser powerful person. We see those in the Bible as well. We see covenants between people of equal power, and we see covenants between different kings, between an emperor and a local king, where the emperor has vastly more power than the local king. And ultimately, we see covenants between God and humanity. I guess the ultimate imbalance of power in which God is infinitely more powerful and more authoritative than human beings. And in each of these types of covenants, we find conditions and unconditional covenants. Now, God has interacted through covenant with his people from the very beginning. And today, we're going to look at that very first covenant that God makes with humanity. He makes it with Adam, the first human being, the man that God created. You see, we start off in Genesis and we read about how God has created the earth and how God created the sky and the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth itself and the plant life and the animal life. And then something odd happens. God had previously spoken into existence all of these other living things. And now with humanity, God gets down into the dirt. He gets his hands dirty and he forms a body out of the dust of the earth. And into that body, God breathes his very life. He breathes into this body his very spirit. And we're told back in Genesis 1 that man and woman were created in the image of God. That is, they're created to be like God, to image God on the earth. They're created to be God's representatives on the earth and to rule over the earth as God would. And so in Genesis chapter 2, we start with the formation of the man, and God breathes life into the man, and then God makes an agreement with the man before the woman is created. And so this will apply to her as well. Before Adam realizes he's alone and he is the only one of his kind on the earth, God gives Adam a command in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. And so let's take a look at what God says to Adam here. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree of the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for on the day you eat from it, you will certainly die." Now, this is the first covenant that we see in the Bible itself, and it starts at the very beginning. Now, later, when we discuss the covenants that will come later, the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Moses, the covenant with David, and ultimately the covenant in Jesus Christ, we see certain forms of covenant. So here we don't see those forms. It's just a command from God. And yet the prophet Hosea later on in the history of Israel will say that Adam and Eve broke the covenant. They transgressed against God and they broke the covenant. Hosea calls this a covenant. And so this is the first covenant made with humanity, and it's a conditional one. It's one between God, the ultimate power, and man, who at this point has no real power except to have the breath of God in him. And it's conditional. The man must work the garden and must care for it and must not eat from this one tree. And we see the condition of the covenant. If the man eats from the fruit of this particular tree, he will surely die. And so this is the strongest of conditional covenants, in which if the lesser party fails to keep it, death is the penalty. This is sometimes called the covenant of works. Not the works to earn God's favor, not the works to earn God's love, but the works that God has given humanity to do, the works of caring for the garden, the works of tending to it, and of not eating from this tree. Yet Adam eats of the tree. We know later in Genesis, after the woman has been created, that a tempter comes into the garden. Satan, in the form of a serpent, the accuser, the tempter, comes in and offers Adam and Eve this bite of this fruit from this forbidden tree. And humanity, trying to grasp godhood for themselves, trying to become more like God than they already are, forgetting that they have the breath of God within them and they've been created in his image, take the fruit of this tree at the word of the tempter, and they break the covenant. And from that moment forward, they are cast out of the Garden of Eden. They're cast out of this paradise that they were to work and to tend, and they're left out in the cold, as it were, to till the ground and to do the same things they were supposed to do in the garden, only now it's going to be hard. The earth isn't going to produce fruit like it would have before. There's going to be thistles and thorns, and it's going to be very difficult. This all comes up in Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve have broken the covenant with God, and God has cast them out of the garden, and therefore God pronounces a curse over them. And so we see that from the very beginning, though God has graciously created a covenant in which there's only one simple condition. They had the entire Garden of Eden to choose from. They had all of these things, but like humans do, like we are so inclined to do, they stretched out their hand to the one thing that was forbidden to them. They were not content after the tempter came and offered them the fruit of this forbidden tree. And this is what we call the fall. The breaking of this first covenant is what we call the fall of humanity, the entrance of sin into the world, where Adam and Eve prior to this were happy to obey their God and follow him and to love him and had a perfect relationship with him, where sin had no hold in the world, where sin wasn't even conceived of. After the fall, sin becomes the ruling principle of humanity. Becomes the way that we interact with the world. This discontent, this desiring to steal godhood away and hold it for ourselves becomes our way of operating. And so our first parents broke the covenant. And since then, we've been breaking that covenant. Since then, humanity in its birth, as we've gone about our lives, we continually break that covenant with God. And so there is hope, though. Even in the middle of the curse, even in the midst of this curse that God pronounces over man and woman and over the serpent, there is hope in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, right in the middle of this curse that God is pronouncing over humanity and this serpent, here's what God says to the serpent. I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Now, from the earliest days of the Christian church, the Christians have read that, looked at that, and said that's a picture of the gospel. The offspring of Adam and Eve crushing the head of the serpent. That's a picture of the one to come, of Jesus Christ, the offspring of God, the Son of God, who would once for all crush the head of the serpent, Satan, and the covenant that he would bring, this hope-filled covenant. And so from that moment, we look forward to the hope of Jesus Christ and the new covenant that he will make. And so, though humanity broke the first covenant, though they failed and fell short and fall, though they failed and fell short and fell from their position, there is hope of a new covenant to come. And we're going to get to that covenant in time, but first we have to make our way through the covenants of the Old Testament to see how they build upon one another and see how ultimately they're all fulfilled in the covenant of Jesus Christ. So I hope you'll stick with me, and I hope that you'll send in any questions or comments that you have. I'd love to interact with you as we go through these sessions together. And I'm sure that if you have questions, other people have questions too. So ask them. Looking forward to next week when we look at the covenant with Noah, what we call the Noahic covenant later in Genesis.